Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the first module of the Grow This Academy. My name is Emily Morrow. I am the Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Agent based in Jefferson County, West Virginia. I have been an Extension Agent for about 9 years and happy to be with you today to talk with you all a little bit about soil. So, the first step with any foundation of a good, healthy garden is going to be a soil sample. And today, that is going to be the focus of our presentation to teach you how to take a good sample, teach you a little bit about the foundations of soil, and how to read those soil sample results. As a county agent, that is probably the most common question that we get, especially here in the springtime. For some background, the basic soil analysis at West Virginia University's lab is free. There are a few additional analyses you can pay for. We will go over those in a little bit more detail. But before you even get outside in your gardens and digging around in the soil, it's important to understand the foundation in which it was formed. If you think of the earth as a giant rock over time, climate, weathering, topography, and all those good healthy soil organisms we love to find in our garden have broke down that rock over time to become the healthy soil we know and love today. And I brought a few visuals to help everybody have a little bit of an understanding of what we're looking at when we look in the ground. Sometimes we think dirt is just dirt, but dirt is a living, breathing resource, and it's important that we treat it as such. When you take a cross-section of soil, soil forms in layers, almost like an onion. So the layer that's up at the top is the most well-defined layer. And for growing a garden, this is the layer we're really concerned about because this is where most of our nutrients make a home, as well as our plant roots. If you dig far deep enough down into your soil, you will see different color changes and what we call different horizons. But when it comes to taking a soil sample, we're trying to sample that top layer, and we're trying to sample to a proper depth in which that most vegetable crops will make their roots a home and pull those nutrients out of the soil. A soil analysis is meant to get an average of your nutrients across an area. So the first thing you're going to need are a few proper tools. Not everybody has access to a soil probe. These are by far the easiest way to take a soil sample because it gets a nice little coarse sample of what we're trying to test. And it's easy to work your way across a large area. You can ask your county extension office if they have one of these available to rent. Most of us do and are happy to loan those out for a small fee. I know in my office, we require a deposit, which you get back paid in full when the tool is returned unharmed. And a few of them have walked away. Not everybody has a soil probe, so a regular garden spade will do just fine. What I do like to overview when I get calls to my office about taking a good soil sample is not to just dig a hole and put all of the contents in a bag. We want to try to replicate what this soil probe is doing, which is getting a nice even distribution of the top few inches as the bottom few inches. A lot of times when you start digging around in the dirt, which I do a lot for my work as well as with my kids at home, we get a little bit of an uneven distribution of the bottom few inches. We only have maybe a little bit of that bottom layer and more of the top layer, which can throw your average off just a little bit. The next step once you have gathered your tools is you're going to think about the area in which you're going to be testing your soil. For most of us on this call today or watching this recording later, it is probably going to be a garden. And most gardens are a little bit on the smaller side, but you want to look at your area and figure out what the average area of the garden is. So maybe it's 200 square feet, maybe you're a large gardener and it's 1,000 square foot, maybe you garden on a whole acre basis. Or maybe you're gardening in raised beds. So once you have your tools, you will work your way across that area, taking your soil samples. For most garden crops, we want to try to get to a depth of 6 to 8 inches because that is where most of our roots kind of stop when it comes to gardening. If you get a little bit too shallow, you're not going to get all those nutrients that are there. And on my soil sample, even though my top layer kind of stops at about 3 inches and changes into subsoil, this is just from my yard, I still want to get some of that sample down the last 3 to 6 inches because there are nutrients there and my garden crops will end up using those. You want to work your way across the area. For gardens, we recommend about 7 to 10 different core samples across your entire garden area. If you have multiple raised beds, you can treat each of those separately as one sample for raised bed number 1, raised bed number 2, especially if you're growing different crops in those raised beds. It doesn't really matter how you take your sample. You can move across the area randomly. I have probably sampled thousands and thousands of acres of soil over my time in extension. So I tend to just move randomly across the field. And what is important is that you take more than just one. If you take one soil sample, you're only getting the average of the nutrients in that one spot. That could be a hot spot of nutrients for a variety of different reasons, or it could be lower than everything else. So just like we learned in math class, probably many, many years ago for many of us, you want to get a good statistical average. The more samples you take, the better it will be. Once you have all those samples, you will place them in a bucket or a bag. A lot of times when I take a lot of samples, I place them in a bag. All of your samples will go in together, and from there you'll remove anything that is not soil. So in my case, it's usually root debris. It might be some bugs. There's usually a few rocks in here as well. And you'll take your sample and try to crumble it up, because then you're going to let your sample air dry. And this part is important because you, one, don't want to pay to ship water to the university lab, and two, you don't want to place your soil in an oven or anything that's going to come up to heat, because it's going to influence your results. Your next step is going to be to go to the university's webpage, soiltesting.wvu.edu, to download the soil sample form. Now, if you visit your county office looking for these forms, we usually do have them available, but we strongly encourage patrons to go online and fill this out because it is a fillable PDF, and several of the required information come in drop-down menus, which makes it a lot easier for the lab when it gets there. And if you miss filling something out, it can influence your results. Maybe you don't always get your soil sample in a timely manner. So just like any other typical form, the top part is your information, your name, your address, your phone number, your email. Your results primarily do come through email, and they also get emailed directly to your county extension office. And if you are in my neck of the woods, sometimes we have folks that live in Martinsburg, but they farm in Jefferson County, or vice versa. So if your mailing address is different from the county in which you're taking the sample, both county offices tend to get a copy of those results. The middle section of the form is going to be your soils information. And some of the really common questions we get on this form include, what do I put under sample ID? This is just a name that you give that sample so you remember where it comes from. When I work with farmers and they take a large sampling, maybe they have 5 different fields, they'll give those names that they already use on the farm to refer to those fields, like home place or back 40 or west front field. On a garden, usually you're just sending in one sample, unless you happen to send something in for your lawn or your fruit trees and your garden all separately. You would just want to name those appropriately. The next part of the form lists for your county where your sample was taken, that it presents itself as a drop-down menu. And then it also asks for your previous management. If it has previously been a a garden, you will put that down there. If it is some undisturbed land that maybe you were thinking about turning into a garden, you would put that there as well. It then asks if you are sampling this in a high tunnel, which is a season extension that many commercial farmers use, and that is just to check yes, and if that is not the case with you, you would leave that blank. The next place is going to ask for the size of your sample area, and the reason why this is important is because you can either put the size of your area in acres or square feet, and this does influence your results. When you present your area in 0.10 acres, you are now going to get fertilizer recommendations in pounds per acre. For most of us gardening at home, that's really not a usable figure, and then you're buying fertilizer in a small bag like this, and this is definitely not going to cover an acre. So for gardeners, I recommend figuring out your square footage, because then you get fertilizer recommendations in ounces per 100 square feet, which for most gardeners is a much more usable figure to work with. And for us at the county level, when we help you with your soil test results, that also helps us as well. The next place on the form asks for your predominant soil series. Now this might seem silly, but soil does have a name. Like soils are grouped together with similar characteristics based on where they're at in the state of West Virginia, based on if they're good use of farming or not. And it also will provide you with some information about maybe how deep that soil is. We do have a state soil in West Virginia. It is the Monongahela silt loam, in addition to several other different types of soil we have all across the state. The next place that's going to be, coming back to soil series, something I forgot to mention is, if you don't know this, that's fine. You can leave that blank. It will provide you with more accurate fertilizer recommendations, but only if you are testing hay, pasture, or agronomic crops like corn, wheat, and soybeans. With a standard garden, we don't really have that data to be able to tell you what your tomatoes might yield on that particular soil sample, and there's so many other variables that go into gardening as well. The next space on the form is your crop code. That's another drop-down menu. We have a variety of crop codes we offer through the soil testing lab. For most people, if you are growing a lot of different types of things in one space, H01, home vegetable garden, is going to be what you're looking for. But there's also ones that will be geared towards an established lawn, orchards, blueberries, brambles, azaleas, other things that you might be looking at. If you are a large-scale garden and you are sending in samples specifically for your tomatoes or your spinach plot or your peppers or your pumpkin patch, you can have really specific crop codes here too. This will play a difference in your results because if you tell us specifically what crop you're going to grow, we are able to give you more accurate fertilizer recommendations, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The next space on the form asks for the date sampled and then the soil texture code. Now, I deal with a lot of folks that might call into the office and they're not sure what to put here, or I see a lot of soil samples that actually have the wrong soil texture code. Maybe it's not filling out that drop-down menu, but a lot of times I think it's a misconception on what soil texture is. And the reason why soil texture is important is because different soil samples, different soil textures can retain and hold fertilizer a little bit differently when it comes to plants. That's the reason why we don't see a lot of farms on the sandy beaches of the Outer Banks. And similarly, why we might not see a lot of farms at the tip-top of mountains where we might have a heavier clay soil. If you are curious about your soil texture in your soil sample when you have it, the easiest way to test that is to just gather your sample in a ball and take a little bit of water and get it to about the consistency of Play-Doh. I have 2 small children. We play with a lot of Play-Doh. We also play with a lot of dirt. And when you work your soil into a ball, you're trying to figure out exactly what the clay content is, because the clay is what's holding that soil together. Soil is some percentage of sand, silt, and clay. It might be a very small percentage of sand, but it's usually present. It might be a very small percentage of clay, but it is also usually present. And as you work your soil, you want to form what's called a ribbon. And a ribbon is, again, measuring the clay content. There is a handy flowchart available on how to do this on the soil testing website. But if my ribbon gets to be about 1 inch or 2 inches before it breaks off, and my soil feels quite floury in my fingers, my soil texture is likely a silt loam. Now I'll say probably of every 10 soil samples that the lab sees, probably about 9 of them are a silt loam. This is going to be our most common soil texture across the whole state of West Virginia. And again, the reason why that is different and why that matters is when you place your soil texture as clay, which sometimes when it first comes out of the ground and you've never worked that soil before, a lot of times it does feel very hard and it can be very difficult to work, especially in this dry weather we've been having. It can feel and behave a lot like clay. So a lot of folks might think that that's naturally our soil texture. So if I put my soil texture as clay, I'm suddenly getting different fertilizer recommendations than if I put it correctly as a silt loam. So that is important to be able to figure out. Lastly, you'll place if your tillage on your garden is no-till or conventional tillage. Now, I mentioned there's a few other analyses that can be paid for. The basic analysis is free, which will provide you with your soil's pH, your soil's phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium levels, and a basic fertilizer recommendations. Additional things that you might be interested in getting your soil tested for would be organic matter percentage. I would recommend this to many gardeners if you're focused on building your soil's fertility over the long term and you want to be able to track that progress. Maybe you started with really poor soil. In my area, we have a lot of developments. So we have a lot of folks moving in and trying to garden on essentially subsoil, or that topsoil has been completely removed in building of those new houses. So they might be interested in tracking how their soil is behaving over the long term with all of the amendments that they're adding to it. The next thing that can be tested for is electrical conductivity. There is a small charge for that. That is a measure of the salt content in the soil. I typically don't recommend that for gardeners unless you're growing under a covered space like a high tunnel or a low tunnel or other type of season extension, and that area is not frequently exposed to rainfall, meaning you would have some sort of irrigation system set up inside of your garden space. Some of you across the state might be growing in that manner, and that's great. When we have just a drip irrigation system, sometimes salt content can build up within the soil, so it can impact the crop's ability to grow. Because just like in our bodies, we have too much salt, it makes us thirsty. It makes our soil and our crops thirsty too. The last thing that can also be added on is a micronutrient package. This might be beneficial for some gardeners, especially if you have reason to believe your soil has some micronutrient deficiencies, which, just like micronutrients tend to be our calcium, our magnesiums, our sulfurs, our borons. Usually they present themselves with some yellowing or some discoloration on the leaves, much like our macronutrient deficiencies. And if you have downloaded the soil sample form, it does provide some information on how to add those to your package. You can pay for those online. There is a web page. I always print out my receipt when I do any of those tests, and I include it in the sample with my bag of soil. So you've got your completed form. You've got your soil ready to go. You only need to mail in about 1 cup of soil into the lab. So this is a little bit too much. This is all topsoil, so I wouldn't need to send in all this much. About half this amount would be fine. That will also reduce your shipping costs. When you do have your soil in a bag, many of our seasoned gardeners and our seasoned West Virginians probably remember those kits we used to distribute. They used to be available at Extension office or Conservation District offices or NRCS offices. We do not manufacture those kits anymore. So we recommend just sending it up in a sandwich bag or some other Ziploc bag. Once you've completed your soil sample, you've let it air dry, you've got all your clods, all of your roots, all of your bugs, all of your rocks taken out of it. I tell folks to write their last name and their sample ID, that sample ID we talked about a little bit, on the bag. But then also the lab likes to receive when the sample is attached to the bag. They like it wrapped around the bag with a rubber band rather than a staple, so there's less chance that those two pieces become separated. The lab does a really great job. They usually handle anywhere between 7,000 and 10,000 soil samples a year. They do a great job of keeping things organized, but we just want to help them with that success when the sample gets there so we can continue offering this service for free for West Virginians. It usually costs me about $10 to mail up a soil sample when I'm only sending up about a cup at a time. And once the lab receives it, results typically take about 2 weeks. Now we are in the peak thrones of gardening season. I know we have gotten some really lovely warm weather, which has really influxes some of our calls for people wanting to take a soil sample. So at periods of high volume like we typically see in April, the lab might take a little bit longer to get those results back. When they do return to you, the report comes to you just like this. This is a sample I sent in, so it's all of my office's information listed up here on the front of the page. And in that, we're looking at 2 different things when we're looking at this soil test. There's a bar chart in the middle, which when it comes to you as a PDF, it usually presents itself in a variety of colors. We're all very visual people, so green and blues mean that your soil is good on nutrients, but once you see yellows and reds, it means you might need to start improving something. I tell folks when they're trying to interpret this bar chart to think of it as their soil's bank account. So we're trying to ask ourselves, does our soil have enough nutrients in its bank to be able to get through the upcoming growing season? Most gardeners, when we get these results back, they have excess of nutrients. And contrary to how most of us probably think of when we think of a bank account, you can have too many nutrients in your soil, but there's really nothing that you can do to be able to lower those nutrients down besides repeat planting of vegetable crops year to year to year. Those nutrients that get reported on that soil test results are phosphorus, potassium, which are 2 of our macronutrients, meaning they're needed by plants in their largest quantities. We do not report on nitrogen because nitrogen is very difficult to test with a basic soil analysis because nitrogen moves a lot within the soil. So we do provide a recommendation for fertilizer recommendation for nitrogen, but that is based on the crop that you are trying to grow. When you are doing a home vegetable garden, I really don't know if you are growing tomatoes, which are a heavier nitrogen user, or beans, which really don't need any nitrogen because they fixate that into the soil. So most of our fertilizer recommendations for a basic home vegetable garden for nitrogen are going to range between 0 and 7, which sounds like a really silly range. But there are notes on the back of the soil test form that give you a guideline on which vegetable crops are heavy nitrogen users versus which don't really need any nitrogen at all, and that can serve as a really helpful guide. Now, nothing in science or soil or anything can ever be quite easy. So although our soil recommendations might say you need 3 ounces of phosphorus per 100 square feet, that doesn't mean I can go to the store and buy any old bag of fertilizer, and if it has phosphorus in it, I can just put 3 ounces on that garden area to supply my phosphorus recommendations. Because there are hundreds of different, if not thousands of different types of fertilizer out there. So when folks call and want to help interpreting those results, the first thing I usually ask is, do you have an idea of what type of fertilizer you want to use? A lot of times that answer is, I make my own compost, I would like to use that. But sometimes that answer is equally, I really have no idea where to start, can you help me with that? And your county agent surely can. This is just a regular bag of fertilizer that I had picked up off of the stores of Walmart, so it's available to anybody. This is called blood meal. It is manufactured from animal products, and when you are looking or purchasing a fertilizer, this is just one, again, of hundreds of different kinds. You want to look for 3 numbers on the bag. The 3 numbers on the fertilizer bag stand for the percent of that fertilizer to contain a percent of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, specifically in that order. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are our key macronutrients, like we mentioned before. Sometimes it's not always painfully obvious on the bag, and you have to go hunting for it on a label. In the case of this fertilizer, it tells me on the back that it is 7% nitrogen, but it does not have any phosphorus or any potassium in it. So if I were to stick those numbers on the bag, it would read 7-0-0. A lot of common fertilizers we might use on the garden are labeled as plant food. So they might be 10-10-10, meaning they have 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, 10% of potassium. This one does supply a little bit of calcium and a little bit of sulfur too. Sulfur can be used to lower pH. In my area, we have a limestone parent material for our soil. So most commonly, my garden samples or any of my samples come back at a pH of over 7. Whereas the optimal pH for most vegetable crops is 6.6.8. If we have any blueberry growers on here, you'll know that that tends to be more like 4.5, 5.0, 5.5 if you're growing some of those acid-loving crops. On the opposite end of the spectrum, some things like alfalfa like a pH to be about 8. So we grow a little bit of that in the Eastern Panhandle too. So once you've figured out your fertilizer that you want to use and you have your fertilizer recommendations in front of you, you will then have to do a little bit of math. Now, we don't make home gardeners do this type of math. I do make my master gardeners learn how to do it for their class, and they hate every second of it. But there are fertilizer calculators out there that you can plug in your results, you can plug in your first chosen fertilizer, and then it will tell you exactly how much you need to apply across your area. And always, we give the recommendation that when in doubt, you should call your county agent for help because we can help you with those calculations as well, or even interpreting what those mean. Kind of going back a little bit to the form, we mentioned that it supplies phosphorus, phosphorus and potassium, and no nitrogen. Another important thing that we ask folks to pay attention to on these soil sample results is down here at the bottom where it says PSAT, and it's included with a percentage. So that is your soil's ability to hold on to phosphorus within its soil system. And if this is reading as high, that means if you put phosphorus again on your soil, it's not going to stay there. Phosphorus is usually quickly bound by soil particles and made unavailable to plants. It's best to apply phosphorus if needed, very close to when you're actively growing plants. But if your soil can hold on to more phosphorus, it could be an environmental risk to put any more on. I do see high levels of this very commonly in garden crops, and when those folks call to ask questions about the results and we start talking about their management of their soil, they almost always say they use compost every single year, Or they say they might use manure maybe from a farm or from their backyard chickens on their garden pretty much routinely every single year. That's not a bad thing, but that's another reason why we strongly recommend a soil test for a garden every year or every other year so you can accurately track how your soil is holding on to those nutrients. There's no sense in you putting into that extra labor or that extra work to put those nutrients on annually if your soil doesn't need it and it's actually not really benefiting your soil in the long term. When choosing a fertilizer, those organic sources, which blood meal and bone meal, 2 things that you can buy at the store, are 2 of those organic sources, but some of those other organic sources might be a compost. I use a lot of manure from my chickens, and I will age that and apply that usually in the fall, away from my actively growing crop. So it's time to work itself into the soil. I usually incorporate it into the soil as well. Those organic sources are slow release, meaning when you apply them in the fall, you might lose a little bit of your nitrogen benefit, which is usually that smell you smell when handling any type of manure, that ammonia getting lost into the atmosphere. But most of your other nutrients will make themselves available to plants over the long term. When you buy a commercial fertilizer, and those things might be your plant food, your 10-10-10, your triple 19, again, that would be 19% nitrogen, 19% phosphorus, 19% potassium. You're better off applying those items in the springtime, closer to when you're growing your plants, because those are synthetic fertilizers, so they're fixed a little bit quicker into the soil. So they're better suited and going to give you a better benefit when you are applying them closer to when you're growing things. So now would be a great time, or within the next month or so, to start putting some of those amendments on once you get your results. Some of our other heavy nitrogen user crops, which are usually things like eggplants or potatoes or peppers or spinach, those things might benefit from split applications of nitrogen. So you would do about half of it in the springtime now and then the other half in the middle of the season, because applying that all at one time could burn your crops. There is a such thing as too much of a good thing when it comes to fertilizer. So other important items to remember as you are preparing your samples, you're getting ready to mail them into the lab, and you're prepping your garden space for the upcoming growing season, is not to get really hung up on if your soil is lacking anything or in excess. It's important to understand that soil fertility is not a marathon, is not a sprint. It's a marathon. It's something that takes several years to be able to work up to. We see a lot of different types of soil samples in the county extension office. There's nothing you could send in that's going to scare us or shock us, but your local county extension agent is a resource here to not only help you prep a good soil sample, submit that, but also on the back end when it comes to actually interpreting and using the results in a way that's going to be sustainable for your garden, sustainable for your garden goals, and help you meet the goal of growing produce for your family for the long term this growing season.
We had one question online. Someone wants to know if Miracle-Gro is good.
So something that I didn't touch on was sometimes in those raised beds, you also purchase those, what we call manufactured soils. So that would be that Miracle-Gro that you purchase. There's different formulations of that Miracle-Gro. I have personally used the water-soluble kind for my houseplants. Usually is that blue crystals that you will dissolve in a couple gallons and then use it as like a watering your plants to provide. I don't have any issues with those synthetic fertilizers. Like I said, I do use those. I think it is important when you're choosing a fertilizer to know how to read a label and make sure that you're applying the right amounts at the right time, so you're not over applying those nutrients. Oh, the survey will be popped up into the chat. That will be providing your team with your points, and our code word for that survey today is soil texture.
They get 100 points for attending today, and if they attend all 6, they'll get 1,000.
So today's survey, if you complete, will give you 100 points, and if you do all 6 of the subsequent ones, your team will get 1,000 points. Oh. All right, thank you all for tuning in, and I appreciate happy gardening.